We build our understanding of the world on a timeline that feels as solid as stone. We are taught that the dawn of human industry began in the sun-baked deserts of the Middle East, that the great empires of antiquity slowly dragged humanity out of the Stone Age, and that the vast oceans kept the continents completely isolated until a few short centuries ago. We believe that history is a straight, well-lit road. We trust the textbooks, we trust the maps. But the earth is a vast, unedited ledger, and sometimes hidden in the darkest, coldest corners of the world, the earth holds physical evidence that shatters the accepted timeline completely. Sometimes it reveals a civilization of staggering industrial power that operated in absolute silence, millennia before the pyramids of Egypt were even a blueprint. In the freezing, primeval forests of northern Michigan, surrounded by the violent, icy waters of Lake Superior, there are deep scars carved into the bedrock. They are the remnants of an empire of extraction, a place where an unknown people tore unimaginable wealth from the ground, operated a flawless industrial machine for thousands of years, and then simply vanished. They left no written language, they left no ruined cities, but they left their tools dropped in the dark exactly where they stood. To comprehend the absolute impossibility of this ancient industry, we must first understand the brutal landscape that hides it. Lake Superior is not merely a lake, it is an inland ocean of fresh, freezing water. It generates its own weather. It is prone to sudden violent gales that have swallowed modern steel freighters whole. Along its southern edge lies the Keweenaw Peninsula, a jagged spine of volcanic rock pointing out into the dark water. And 50 miles off the coast, completely isolated in the fog, sits Isle Royale. This specific region harbours a geological anomaly found almost nowhere else on the face of the planet. Deep within the ancient basalt lies copper. But it is not copper ore, the typical compound mixed with rock and impurities that requires massive, complex and toxic smelting operations to separate. This is native. Copper. It is 99% pure. It exists in veins, in massive subterranean sheets and in enormous lumps known as float copper. It is so pure that a man could pull a chunk of it from the earth and beat it directly into a tool without ever lighting a furnace. In the early 1840s, word of this pristine, untouched copper reached the civilized, industrialized cities of the American East. A brilliant, ambitious young geologist named Douglas Houghton surveyed the peninsula and published a report detailing the staggering wealth hidden beneath the soil. His report triggered the first great mining boom in American history. It happened a full decade before the famous gold rush of California. Thousands of men boarded wooden schooners and sailed into the treacherous, unpredictable waters of Lake Superior. They were hardened men, miners from Cornwall, immigrants fleeing famine in Ireland, businessmen from Boston. They endured brutal, suffocating winters where the snow drifted 20 feet high, isolating them entirely from the rest of the world for 6 months at a time. They came with iron pickaxes, black powder, and the absolute, unquestioned certainty that they were the pioneers. They believed they were the first civilized men to strike steel against the ancient silent rock of the American North. They were wrong. The realization did not happen all at once. It began as a series of strange, unsettling anomalies in the deep, quiet woods. Prospectors, hiking through the dense, primeval forests of towering hemlock and white pine, began to notice strange depressions in the earth. The ground was not flat. It was heavily scarred with long, continuous trenches, some stretching for hundreds of yards, others for miles. At first, the men assumed these were natural ravines, carved by ancient rivers or the movement of glaciers retreating at the end of the Ice Age. But in the bitter winter of 1847, an agent for the Minnesota Mining Company named Samuel O. Knapp made a discovery that would permanently alter the silent history of the Great Lakes. Knapp was exploring a high ridge near the Ontonagon River, pushing his way through the deep, blinding snow. He noticed a continuous line of depressions running along the southern slope of the ridge, far too regular to be natural. Following his instincts as a veteran miner, he ordered his men to clear the snow from one of the deepest hollows and begin digging into the frozen earth. They dug through the thick topsoil. They dug through thick layers of accumulated dead leaves, pine needles, and rotting timber. And then their shovels struck something hard. It was not the solid, continuous face of natural bedrock. It was rubble. Loose, broken rock. Knapp and his men had dug directly into an artificial pit. As they cleared the debris, the true nature of the depression revealed itself. It was a trench, carved directly and deliberately into the solid rock. And the rock had not been carved by the slow, blind forces of nature. Laying in the dirt at the bottom of the trench, buried under centuries of soil, were tools. They were smooth, heavy stones shaped like rounded mauls or sledgehammers. Many of them had deep, precise grooves carved around their centres, perfectly designed to be lashed to heavy wooden handles. There were dozens of them, then hundreds. As the 19th century men kept digging, they pulled thousands of these ancient stone hammers from the earth. Knapp pushed his crew to dig deeper, fascinated and unnerved by what they were uncovering. They excavated a massive cavern, extending 26 feet deep into the solid earth. The deeper they went, the more terrifying the evidence of ancient industry became. At the bottom of the dark cavern, Knapp found a solid mass of pure native copper. It was an absolute monster of a stone, a metallic leviathan weighing an estimated 10,000 pounds. But it was not resting naturally in the earth where geology had placed it. The 10-ton mass of copper had been severed from the surrounding rock wall. And underneath the massive block of metal, preserving it from the damp floor of the cavern, were wooden timbers. The ancient miners had levered the 10-ton mass of solid copper off the floor of the cave and wedged thick, heavy oak logs underneath it to raise it up. The freezing, oxygen-deprived environment of the subterranean water had preserved the wood in a state of suspended animation. The logs, marked by the ancient tools that cut them, were still there. Knapp stood in near the dark cavern, holding a flickering lantern, staring at a 10-ton piece of metal suspended on wooden beams. This was not the work of a small wandering tribe looking for a piece of shiny metal to pound into an arrowhead. This was heavy industrial engineering. This required massive organization, staggering amounts of physical labor, an understanding of physics and leverage, and an insatiable consuming desire for copper. And the massive copper boulder had been worked. Its surface was completely smooth, pounded free of all jagged edges. The ancient miners had systematically chipped away every protruding piece of metal they could break. Off, harvesting the copper over what must have been months or years of agonizing labor. Knapp's discovery in 1847 was not an isolated incident. As more mining companies arrived on the Keweenaw Peninsula and ventured out to Isle Royale, they quickly realized that the easiest, most reliable way to find profitable copper veins was simply to follow the ancient trenches. The ghosts of the past became the prospectors for the present. The scale of the ancient operation began to reveal itself, and the mathematics of it were entirely impossible. Modern geological surveys of the region have spent decades attempting to map the ancient workings. They found pits that plunged 30 feet deep through solid stone. They found trenches that ran continuously for 2 miles through the dense forest, cutting across the landscape with terrifying purpose. On Isle Royale alone, there are an estimated 10,000 ancient mining pits. To break the solid basalt rock, the ancient miners used a technique known as fire setting. It is a grueling, incredibly dangerous and highly coordinated method of extraction. They would haul massive amounts of timber into the deep trenches and build roaring fires directly against the rock face. They would let the fire burn for days, superheating the stone to incredible temperatures, filling the trenches with choking, blinding smoke. Then they would haul thousands of gallons of freezing water from the lake or nearby streams and throw it directly onto the superheated rock. The sudden violent change in temperature would cause the rock to crack, fracture and shatter. Then the miners would move in through the steam and the smoke with their heavy stone mauls. They would smash the fractured rock, pounding it away to reveal the shining veins of pure copper. The sheer physical exertion required for this process is difficult for the modern mind to comprehend. Archaeologists have recovered the stone mauls by the hundreds of thousands. Some of these stones weigh over 40 pounds. Imagine lifting a 40-pound stone hammer, swinging it against solid rock. in the suffocating depths of a trench. The logistics of an operation of this magnitude defy everything we are taught about the ancient history of North America. To run an industrial mining complex of this size, you need more than just men with hammers. You need a massive, highly organized support system. You need thousands of people. You need men to cut the timber and haul it to the pits. You need people to hunt, forage, and transport thousands of pounds of food to feed a labor force that is burning thousands of calories a day. You need engineers to construct the boats. You need administrators. You need an empire. But there are no grand ruined cities in the forests of northern Michigan. There are no massive stone temples. There are no sprawling burial grounds containing the tens of thousands of workers who must have lived, labored, and died in the freezing shadow of the lake. There are only the holes in the ground. The question of when this happened is just as terrifying to the historical establishment as how it happened. When the 19th century miners like Samuel Knapp found the pits, they noted the trees growing out of them. Massive ancient white pines and hemlocks had taken root in the accumulated dirt. But beneath the roots of those ancient trees were thick layers of dead vegetation, leaves and soil that had taken centuries to accumulate. When modern science developed radiocarbon dating, researchers finally had a way to test the physical remains. They tested the wooden levers, the charcoal, and the bone fragments. The dates that came back sent a shockwave through the academic establishment, a shockwave that was quietly suppressed. The mining did not happen a few hundred years before Christopher Columbus. The mining did not happen during the time of the Roman Empire. The mining began around 5,000 years before the birth of Christ. 5,000 years before Christ. To put that timeline into perspective, the ancient copper miners of Lake Superior were tearing open the earth 1,000 years before the first stones of the Great Pyramid of Giza were laid in the shifting sands of Egypt. They were running an industrial metal extraction operation 2,000 years before the city of Babylon was founded. They were working the rock before the first organized dynasties of China existed. They worked the mines continuously for nearly 4,000 years, and then, around 1,200 years before Christ, they stopped. The mining abruptly, violently, ceased. We are faced with a civilization that operated an industrial complex for 4 millennia, predating every major known empire in human history, and then vanished without leaving a single written word or a single ruined wall. But the greatest, most profound mystery of Lake Superior is not the age of the mines. It is the accounting of the metal. Geologists and mining engineers have studied the volume of rock removed from the tens of thousands of ancient pits across the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale. By calculating the average yield of the copper veins in the region, they have arrived at a conservative estimate of how much pure copper was extracted by the ancient miners over those thousands of years. The numbers are catastrophic to the official historical narrative. The estimates suggest that between 500,000 and 1.5 million tons of pure copper were removed from the earth. 500,000 tons, 1 billion pounds of metal. If you ask the academic establishment where this staggering amount of copper went, they will point to a loosely defined, vaguely understood group of indigenous peoples they call the Old Copper Culture. They will show you museum display cases filled with beautifully crafted copper spear points, crescent knives, beads, and awls found in burial mounds across Wisconsin, Michigan, and the Ohio River Valley. They will tell you that the local hunter-gatherer tribes spent 4,000 years performing grueling, back-breaking, highly organized industrial mining simply to make a few fishing hooks and decorative jewelry, and then forgot how to do it entirely. But the mathematics of this explanation is a profound insult to logic. If you were to take every single indigenous copper artifact ever discovered in North America, from the deep woods of Canada to the deserts of Mexico, and place them on a massive scale, the total weight would amount to a few tons, at the very most perhaps 10 or 20 tons of metal. Where is the other 499,980 tons? You cannot misplace 500,000 tons of pure copper. It does not evaporate into the air. It does not dissolve in the rain. It is a heavy, indestructible, incredibly valuable physical resource. If it stayed in North America, we would have found it. We would have found massive copper cities. We would have found millions of heavy copper tools, weapons, and statues. But the copper is not here. The physical evidence demands a conclusion that the academic institutions of the world have spent a century trying to bury. The copper did not stay in North America. It was exported. It was taken away on an industrial scale, transported down the rivers, loaded onto ships, and sent across the oceans. And if we look at the timeline, the destination of the missing copper aligns with terrifying perfect precision with the greatest technological explosion in the history of the ancient world, the Bronze Age. Around 3,000 years before Christ, the civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Europe suddenly leaped out of the Stone Age. They learned that by combining copper with a small amount of tin, they could create bronze, a metal hard enough to hold a razor-sharp edge, hard enough to build impenetrable armor, hard enough to conquer the known world. The Bronze Age required unimaginable amounts of copper. The empires of the Mycenaeans, the Minoans, the Egyptians, and the Sumerians consumed metal on a staggering scale. They built massive fleets of ships. They equipped armies of hundreds of thousands of men. They built the weapons that forged human history. But there is a fatal, glaring geographical flaw in the history of the Bronze Age. The Mediterranean region is relatively poor in copper. The ancient mines of Cyprus and the Sinai Peninsula, while heavily worked, were mathematically insufficient to produce the sheer volume of metal required to fuel the Bronze Age empires for thousands of years. The ancient world was desperate for copper. They were master navigators, they mapped the stars, they built ships capable of crossing open oceans. Is it truly impossible to believe that a fleet of ancient cargo ships, driven by the insatiable, highly lucrative demand for the metal that ruled the world, caught the trade winds and crossed the Atlantic? If you follow the natural ocean currents from the coast of Europe or North Africa, they naturally pull a vessel westward, toward the Caribbean and the eastern seaboard of North America. Once there, the massive gaping mouth of the St. Lawrence River serves as a wide, navigable highway, leading directly into the heart of the continent. If you sail up the St. Lawrence River past the deep woods of Canada, you eventually arrive at the Great Lakes. You arrive at the largest deposit of pure native copper on the planet. This is not a theory built on empty speculation. It is a theory built on the microscopic chemistry of the metal itself. In the late 20th century, metallurgical scientists began analyzing the chemical composition of Bronze Age artifacts found in Europe. Copper is not a uniform, identical substance. It contains microscopic trace elements, tiny amounts of silver, lead, nickel, or iron. These trace elements act as a geological fingerprint, allowing scientists to trace a piece of ancient bronze back to the exact mine the copper was originally extracted from. When researchers tested the ancient bronze of the Mediterranean and Europe, they found an anomaly they could not explain away. A significant percentage of the copper used in the Old World possessed an incredibly high level of purity, accompanied by a very specific trace amounts of silver. It did not match the chemical fingerprint of the mines in Cyprus. It did not match the mines of the Middle East or the Alps or Spain. It perfectly matched the chemical signature of the native float copper found on the Kawainar Peninsula of Lake Superior. The 500,000 tons of missing American copper did not vanish into thin air. It is sitting in the glass display cases of the British Museum, the Louvre, and the Vatican. It is the bronze swords of the ancient Greeks. It is the armor worn during the Trojan War. It is the tools used to carve the massive stones of the pharaohs. The ancient miners of Lake Superior were not an isolated, primitive culture digging in the dirt for beads. They were the blue-collar workforce of a massive, intercontinental, global supply chain that operated thousands of years before Christopher Columbus was even a thought in the mind of history. But the academic establishment cannot allow this timeline to exist. If they admit that the ancient people of the world were crossing the oceans in massive cargo ships in 3000 BC, the entire structure of modern historical education collapses. The neat, organized chapters of the textbooks would have to be torn out and rewritten. The illusion that civilization evolved in isolated, disconnected bubbles, gradually discovering each other over time, would be shattered. And so, the quiet, bureaucratic machinery of erasure went to work. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, institutions like the Smithsonian systematically buried the evidence of transoceanic contact. They ignored the mathematical impossibility of the missing copper. They classified the tens of thousands of ancient mining pits as a localized curiosity, attributing thousands of years of industrial labor to people they claimed had no organized society. When independent researchers pointed out the identical fire-setting techniques used in ancient Wales and ancient Michigan, they were dismissed as cranks. When men found heavy stone mauls left sitting in the American trenches that perfectly matched the tools used in the ancient copper mines of the British Isles, they were ignored. The institutions built a massive invisible wall around the history of North America, declaring that the oceans were impassable barriers, and anyone who suggested otherwise was a charlatan. But you cannot argue with the physical reality of a 30-foot trench carved into solid basalt. You cannot argue with the silence of the tools left behind in the dark. And perhaps the most haunting, deeply unsettling aspect of the Lake Superior mines is not their immense age or their staggering scale, but the exact manner in which they were abandoned. If a mining operation slowly runs out of ore, or if a civilization gradually declines due to disease or changing climates, you expect to find a slow, organized withdrawal. You expect the valuable tools to be packed up and taken away. You expect the deepest pits to be emptied of their remaining metal. But that is not what the 19th century miners found. When Samuel Knapp and the others cleared the dirt and the centuries of debris from the ancient trenches, they found the tools sitting exactly where the ancient workers had left them. They found heavy stone mauls resting precariously on rock ledges, waiting to be picked up again. They found copper wedges stuck deep into the crevices of the stone, waiting to be struck by a hammer that never came. They found the charred remains of fires that had been prepared with timber and kindling, but never lit. It looked as if a massive, deafening, highly organized industrial operation had simply stopped in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The workers set down their hammers. They dropped their chisels. They walked out of the trenches, disappeared into the dense, silent forests of the north, and never returned. What could cause an army of thousands of miners to walk away from the most lucrative, productive copper deposit on the planet, leaving their heavy, valuable tools behind? If we look at the timeline of the ancient world, the date of the abandonment aligns with a chilling, catastrophic precision. Around 1200 years before Christ, the ancient world ended. Historians call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. In the span of a few short, violent decades, every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East suffered a catastrophic systemic collapse. The grand Mycenaean palaces of Greece burned to the ground. The powerful Hittite Empire of Anatolia was utterly destroyed. The ancient complex trade routes were permanently severed. The massive, interconnected global economy of the Bronze Age shattered into 1,000 isolated, terrifying pieces. Scholars debate the cause endlessly. Was it a series of massive earthquakes, a decades-long systemic drought, the sudden, mysterious invasion of the marauding sea peoples? Whatever the cause, the destruction was absolute. The empires that demanded the copper, the fleets of massive ships that transported the copper, and the central authorities that paid the miners all ceased to exist. Imagine the scene in the deep, freezing woods of northern Michigan. The miners have extracted their quota for the season. The 10-ton mass of copper is raised on its oak timbers, waiting to be broken down, dragged to the shore, and transported to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. They wait by the shores of the Great Lake. They wait for the ships. They wait for the traders. They wait for the supplies, the compensation, and the news from the old world. But the ships never come. The years pass. The brutal winter snows fill the trenches. The food runs out. The realization slowly dawns on the miners that the world they were digging for no longer exists. The global supply chain has been severed. The copper, without the ships to take it to the bronze foundries of the East, is now worthless. They drop their heavy stone mauls. They leave the metal suspended on the rotting oak logs. They walk away into the wilderness, forced to forget their industrial past and integrate into the nomadic survival-based cultures of the North American continent. The silence falls over the lake. The white pines take root in the dirt. The centuries turn into millennia. The memory of the ocean-crossing ships fades into mythology, and the mythology fades into the dust. Thousands of years later, men with iron pickaxes and steam engines arrive on the peninsula. They find the holes in the ground. They find the tools in the dark. And because they are men of the modern age, filled with the absolute hubris of their own timeline, they convince themselves that they are looking at the crude work of primitive savages. We walk through the modern world believing that our global economy is a brand new invention. We believe that we are the first civilization to conquer the oceans, to connect the continents, to extract resources on a massive scale, and to operate an international supply chain. We trust the history books that tell us the oceans were vast, empty, terrifying voids until a few hundred years ago. We believe that the past was simple, isolated and small, but history is a graveyard of forgotten global empires. The earth keeps its own ledgers, recorded in the chemistry of the metal and the deep, silent scars carved into the bedrock. When an academic institution possesses the power to look at 500,000 tons of missing metal, ignore the thousands of heavy tools left in the dark, and declare that the ancient world was entirely incapable of crossing the sea, what other massive, terrifying truths have been deleted from the archives? How much of the world we walk through is built on the ruins of a highly advanced civilization that was deliberately, systematically erased from our memory to protect a timeline that isn't real? Maybe the identical fire-setting techniques found across the ocean were just a stunning, impossible geological coincidence. Maybe the massive 40-pound stone walls were simply used by a few local tribes with an unprecedented, inexplicable obsession with digging holes they didn't need. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was simply a series of accidents, a massive misunderstanding of primitive labor. And the missing 500,000 tons of copper are still hiding somewhere beneath the undisturbed soil of the American Midwest. Or maybe the men who descended into the freezing, dark pits of Lake Superior saw something we no longer recognize. Maybe they saw the undeniable physical proof that the old world was not old and the new world was not new. What if the oceans have never kept humanity apart, but merely washed away the evidence of how terrifyingly close we used to be?